Everyone, and welcome to a bonus episode of Old Spook Lane Creepy Chats, where we talk about creepy topics this month on Creepy Chats. So I hope that you guys have been enjoying all the spooky stuff that we've been covering this month. Right now, we just have a few little nuggets of various podcasts we're going to be releasing before Thanksgiving and before Christmas, just to kind of like ease the celebration of Halloween. If you did celebrate it, happy Halloween. If not, then I hope that you guys had a nice autumn solstice. So yeah, I'm here with two very special guests to discuss about a very special movie. So I'm with me. I have back Nikki Blake from ScoobyAddicts. So welcome back, Nikki.
Thank you.
And we also have another new guest this time around. So please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Mark Norman. I'm the creator and host of the Folklore Podcast. I'm a folklorist and author, and amongst my authoring is the book Zoinks, the Spooky Folklore Behind Scooby-Doo, which released recently.
All right, then. Well, thank you so much for coming on by. I really do appreciate it. And yeah, I definitely am interested in checking out the book. So yeah, so today we're going to be discussing about the 1999 direct-to-video movie Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost, which is the second out of the Mook Animation films. For those who didn't tune to our last podcast from last year, we talked about Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island, which was the film that pretty much rejuvenated the franchise, in which that around the 90s it was just kind of like dwindling down a little bit. A pup named Scooby-Doo kind of ended its run, and then there was like a handful of other projects that were airing on Cartoon Network as reruns. There was like an additional Scooby-Doo movie that was airing, Scooby-Doo and Arabian Nights, but that was just kind of like a short off thing that was trying to cash in on, the last bits of Scooby-Doo that they had left. But it wasn't until Zombie Island that brought it back, and this is kind of like a follow-up to it. So yeah, I know that Nikki, we had you on the podcast last year talking about Zombie Island, and you talked about your history of Scooby. So I'd like to give Mark an opportunity to talk about his first introduction of Scooby, and especially with your new book coming out. So I'd like to know from you, Mark. Please tell us your history.
Sure. Well, I suppose my history goes back to towards the beginning of Scooby-Doo, because I'm probably the oldest person in the room at this moment, having been born in the beginning of the 1970s, so just after the start of Scooby. But being in the UK, it's a slightly trickier job for me to watch a lot of episodes. So I certainly grew up with the show, but I very much grew up with the original versions of the show. I think probably the first two seasons of Where Are You were very commonly screened in the UK and oft repeated. What's now season 3, which was obviously differently branded when it first came out, we didn't have broadcast here, and in fact it's been not the easiest job in the world to research that for me. I had to have material shipped over from the States to research that series. For some reason it never made it to these shores. I had to put up with a number of seasons of Scrappy. I don't think it affected me too badly. Other people will probably be able to tell you far better than I. That was uh, like everywhere else, it was attempted to be popular in the kind of later 70s into the 80s. Didn't go terribly well, but there you are. Um, so really, it's the earlier seasons for me that kind of kindled the interest, and then I've returned to it later on in a much more serious way and from a slightly different approach, obviously by writing about the show. I mean, primarily, I'm not a pop culture historian in that way. I'm a social historian, so I write about folklore and folk belief and things like that. So therefore, it's the premise behind the show that is primarily my area of interest. So the monsters and the settings and those sorts of things. Um, but what I've tried to do with this book is kind of wrap the whole package together. So the book looks at the myths and the legends and the folklore that the show has drawn on over that kind of 55-year period, um, where it's done it well, where it's done it slightly dubiously, and what it's tried to achieve. But at the same time, it looks at the way that we as people, as a culture, have kind of influenced the show as well, and the urban myths and the legends that have grown up around it. I think it's important to say as well that these are not just my views. I've been quite careful to kind of go to a number of the show's writers and creators as much as possible and try and get their input into this as well to kind of draw the whole package together. So that's kind of my approach to it. Really, the whole thing came out of a very chance comment that I read in a completely unconnected book about the filming and the history of the Wicker Man, where there was a random sentence that kind of said, "Well, I mean, imagine if Mystery Incorporated had gone to Summer Isle and investigated what was going on there. What would that look like?" And I thought, well, that's an interesting concept. Somebody must have looked at that from the kind of folklore perspective, how actual investigations into those things would have gone. But they hadn't, so I
Hmm.
did.
Interesting. And I guess you're actually the perfect guest to bring on this podcast because Witch's Ghost, it does kind of lean a little bit more towards folklore because where it's set in Massachusetts, more specifically in a fictional town called Oakhaven, which was inspired by
Mm.
Salem, Massachusetts, which is very well known for the witch trials and rumors about witches. So I would love to, again, talk more about that as the show goes on. But yeah, right now let's just talk briefly about Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost. So came out in 1999. The plot synopsis goes as this: is that Mystery Inc. were hired by a very well-known horror writer known as Ben Ravenscroft because there's a lot of misconceptions about his ancestor named Sarah. And, she was, according to him, a Wiccan, which is basically like a medicine woman who constantly was helping out people. And then there was a whole bunch of rumors spreading around that she's actually a witch. There was a whole bunch of, rumors going around that Oakhaven is having this huge fall celebration celebrating on Sarah Ravenscroft, and he wants to be able to clear that misconception as well as try to find her journal that he can be able to clear out all of the misconceptions about his ancestor. And yeah, they just basically like have this investigation with that at first, but then there's little bits of pieces of this mystery building up about like, okay, there's a ghost of Sarah Ravenscroft, and who's responsible for this, and there's a lot of other things mixed in there as well that we'll talk about later throughout the show. So yeah, I like to know, how did you first learn about Witches Ghost? I'm sure Nikki, you probably saw it maybe shortly after Zombie Island, maybe when it was probably promoted either on VHS or probably on Cartoon Network where it was showing a lot at the time.
Yeah, I want to say at the time Warner Brothers contacted me to let me know that it was coming out. I can't remember if that was one of the things that they sent me to review or not.
Mhm.
It's been a long time.
Fair enough.
But yeah, I definitely saw the promos for it.
Okay. And how about you, Mark? I mean, this will be interesting considering that, like you said earlier, that a lot of the Scooby-Doo shows didn't really make it too much into the UK. Otherwise, you probably didn't see it until a little bit later on. So about the movies, like, were you able to get a hold of the movies from watching it on TV, or did they release on VHS a little bit later on?
They did release on VHS a bit later on for the most part in the UK. So I would have, I mean, some of them were broadcast, and some I would have seen as broadcast. Although that was, the direct TV movies are a lot later on. Certainly at a time where I wouldn't have had a primary interest in watching Scooby necessarily that often. So for me, most of the movies I've watched later as part of research for the book as much as anything else. So there's a whole raft of the kind of the directed video, directed TV, directed whatever format they went direct to movies that I've pulled together for research. So this kind of falls in that middle period where it would have come out on VHS, but wouldn't have been something that I would have necessarily easily picked up at that time. So for me, it's a little bit later on for this one.
Okay, that's very interesting. Yeah. So I think we'll be taking a look at this in two camps, like somebody who have seen the series when it first came out, and then others who probably saw it a little bit later and seen it from a different perspective. As for me, like I said last year when I first heard about Zombie Island, I remember hearing about it probably on either VHS or on Cartoon Network, and no exception for Witch's Ghost, in which I did hear about the promotions probably on VHS or Cartoon Network. And I was really intrigued on watching it because I really enjoyed Zombie Island. So I wanted to take a look to see what Witch's Ghost had to offer. So yeah. Again, if you want to know more about myself and Nikki's history on Scooby-Doo, go check out the Zombie Island podcast. So yeah, let's go into it. So yeah, I think that one of the things that was really interesting, very similar to what Zombie Island did, is that it kind of starts off a little bit slow and it kind of like lets your guard down a little bit, where you get reintroduced to the gang again, and they're having a mystery solved in a museum where they're disguising themselves as the exhibits and trying to capture these thieves. And then you have Ben Ravenscroft coming along, hiring Mystery Inc. because he was able to help them out, and then going over to Oakhaven, which is where he grew up, and he got his inspirations for his book, and sees that it's a massive tourist attraction, and at the same time it's still getting its history of the witches, very similar to what Salem witch trials were back in the 1600s. So yeah, I mean, it does definitely capture that fall essence, which is kind of like something similar to like Sleepy Hollow, if anybody is familiar with the classic tale by Washington Irving, or if they've probably seen Ichabod and Mr. Toad from Disney, or even the Tim Burton Sleepy Hollow, if you're a little bit more into like the more darker macabre stuff. So yeah, I mean, I think that the fall setting actually makes it really interesting in its atmosphere, and again, capturing the essence of going into a town very well known for its witch trials and witches, and again, building up the atmosphere slowly and little by little, and building up more of the mystery of possibly either that Sarah Ravencroft was a witch or not. So yeah, I think that it does slowly start building up to it. I think it has a better pace of it than I would say with Zombie Island, because with Zombie Island, it's like, you jump from one thing to another and then to another, where you basically have the gang coming together and then they're trying to find something scary. It isn't until they go over into Moonscar Island, and then that's when things start picking up. I mean, in Witches Ghost, it starts picking up right away, where they're immediately at the place where they're at supposed to be originally, and we already know what the plan is. I guess, for people who saw Zombie Island, it's kind of like a much more gradual thing to come into. I think that for Witches Ghost, it's like a continuation, where Zombie Island was kind of like a starting point. I mean, if you did see Witches Ghost as your first one, I guess it'll be a little bit easier for you to comprehend the characters that we've come to know for over 40 years at that point. You have Fred, Daphne, Velma, Shaggy, and Scooby. They all have the same traits. They've just been a little bit updated, or from that particular time in the 90s. So yeah, I think that it does start off things pretty well.
I think one of the things that you can do with these, I don't know whether Nikki would agree with this, is with the TV movies, you have the opportunity to work outside of the kind of 22 minutes with a couple of commercial breaks format, so you can have more of a slow burn start. You're not trying to cram a whole story into a very short space of time. So there is time for plot development, there is time for character development. But at the same time, for those that know the show, by starting with the sequence that they do in the museum, it's very much a tried and tested routine. So anybody who's coming to it with a little bit of knowledge is going to feel comfortable that they're in the right place before things take a slightly different approach. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I really like the way that they introduced Ben Ravencroft in this as well. Like I feel like it was the best way for them to introduce him. He's kind of like hidden, he's in the background and he trips them and he helps them to capture the bad guys and then he reveals himself and yeah.
Yeah. And again, with Ben Ravenscroft played by the amazing Tim Curry, which I think that it has been stated that he is a massive Scooby fan. Now, again, I know that there's a lot of conflicting rumors about, he was originally supposed to be in the live action movie, but when he heard that Scrappy-Doo was in it, he decided to decline it. It's never been 100% proven to see if it's true or not, but for the most part, it has been confirmed that he is actually a Scooby fan, and I'm sure that he was more than happy to be along with this. And he does play a really good job of, playing as this very sensible guy who is, even though that he's a well-known writer, he's just trying to convince the town that he grew up in that his ancestor is not a witch but was actually a really nice person who just used her healing abilities for others. So yeah, he definitely just plays that really, really nice guy. And then of course when you get to the third act and you get to know more about the fact that no, it's she actually is been a witch this entire time, and the journal was actually a spell book, and he starts turning into a warlock. It's like that's when Tim Curry acts his Tim Curryness with his over the top hamminess, and it actually just goes in very well. I mean, I couldn't imagine anybody other than Tim Curry to play such a drastic role like that.
And you know that he's a villain, Patricia, because he's got a British accent, right? We're all like that.
Hey, well, my husband is British, so
I'm
he's not
making no
necessarily.
further comment.
Fair enough, fair enough. But no, I guess I'm just into the bad boys. Who knows? Anyway, but yeah, it's kind of funny that you mentioned that because Tim Curry, he's just a delight, and he's just an absolute treat as Ben Ravenscroft, and I definitely do enjoy his presence, and he was just a great addition into this lineup of characters. Yeah, so I guess we can start talking about like the town itself, Oakhaven. So yeah, I really do like the way that it's presented. It's a small town in Massachusetts, very similar to like a lot of small towns over there where it's steeped in history. So again, going into your book about the folklore. So yeah, I like to know about your thoughts about how they were able to portray this.
We, I think there's a dual approach here. Although again, I'm not sure that I can prove this, but we've obviously got the whole kind of Sleepy Hollow and Salem kind of thing feeding into Oakhaven. But I also wonder whether Oakhaven isn't a pastiche on Crowhaven as well. And this is something that I talk about a little bit in the book. So in the 1970s, there was a supernatural TV movie in the States, very, very folk horror-y TV movie called Crowhaven Farm. And it's got a lot of this kind of vibe about it. So a rural kind of place, this couple buy a farm. A woman called Maggie ends up living there, has very strange visions as to what's going on. There are some very kind of creepy and just a little bit too friendly to be comfortable neighbors. They adopt a child who turns out to be a very creepy child indeed. And the whole thing is wrapped up in kind of witchcraft and the Salem witch trials and the whole folk horror vibe. And I don't wonder whether Oakhaven is just pastiche and Crowhaven from that series or that film in the 70s. I can't prove it, but because I haven't spoken to the writers for this one, but I suspect it possibly is the case.
Hmm. I never actually thought of that. That's actually really interesting. Yeah, I mean, maybe that is. Maybe it's maybe like a collage of a whole bunch of things. Maybe it could be a combination of that TV movie mixed with the traditions of what a lot of people would know about the Salem witch trials and about Massachusetts. So who knows? It may be a possibility. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of history of witches in Massachusetts and in Connecticut too. Especially if again said, Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, or probably as recently as The Owl House, which is a 2020 Disney Channel animated series, which took place in Connecticut and is about a different world that is outside of the human world called the Boiling Isles, which is about witches. And one of the characters just so happens to be a human from like 400 years ago who was originally from Connecticut and who has a prejudice towards witches. So, yeah, there just seems to be like this seeped history about witches and warlocks and magic, and especially with a massive religious overtone about that, people who were seen outside of society were deemed as witches. And so I think that, having it set like that, where we had Louisiana in Zombie Island and then going over to Massachusetts, I think that was actually a really nice, interesting contrast, especially since I believe that maybe around where Zombie Island was, it was probably like around summertime. So going into like the autumn, which, again, fits in the Halloween spirit, it actually, clicks in very, very well. And
Velma addresses this whole point though, right? Because Velma talks about the Salem witch trials,
yes.
and she talks about the fact that it was the othering of people who are different, which is a really, really key point behind the whole concept of early modern witchcraft and the persecution. And this is one of a couple of episodes, for want of a better term, of Scooby-Doo that deal with this point really well. The other one being World of Witchcraft from Be Cool, which again deals with this whole persecution aspect very well.
Mhm.
And Velma highlights that very point, that there are other things about the history of Sarah Ravencroft which we should address, which are quite problematic. But that is a very good one that Velma highlights for me.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. Why don't you bring it up, Mark? Now that you brought up the whole Sarah Ravenscroft thing.
Well, the problematic part about it, of course, is that they call her a Wiccan. Um, and the Wiccan movement is something that comes out of the 1960s and the 1970s, formulated as a kind of religion by Gerald Gardner in the UK, amongst others. Um, so they're conflating two different things. And again, Velma describes the etymology of witch in this show, and she does it pretty well. Um, but they're conflating Wicca with Wicca with an E, as in the etymology of witch. So Wicce, the word Wicca from the Old English, refers to the terminology of witchcraft or people who do that sort of thing. But that's very, very different from being a Wiccan, which is what the show is conflating. So you do have to pick those two things apart. Everything else about Sarah's history is great. The fact that she was healer, the fact that they talk about this oak tree, and oak is very important in terms of healing and witchcraft and these sorts of things. Those are all brilliant. The only thing for me as a folklorist and a picky, annoying person that lets this down is this conflation between Wicca and witchcraft
All right
generally.
then. All
Push that
right.
aside, everything else is great.
All right. Well, Nikki, from a perspective of knowing about the Scooby franchise, how is Sarah Ravenscroft as like one of the villains compared to the ones that we've seen from that point on?
I mean, she was a real ghost. So, yeah. I mean, Zombie Island wasn't the first thing to have real ghosts, even though everybody's like, oh, the monsters were real.
Yeah,
The
I guess
first
everybody
time,
forgot about Boo Brothers.
Moo Brothers, Scrappy, like, sorry, I don't
Yeah.
mean to bring up bad characters, but it was in Scrappy. It's, not the first time. But for them to carry that into Witch's Ghost, I really like that because, you know, the way that they did this, where they have this person that's dressed up as the ghost and they solve this mystery, but then the mystery's not really over because Ben Ravencroft isn't done and he needs to bring her out of this book. And I really like when they do real ghosts. Not that I'd want it all the time, but I really liked it, and I really liked it in Witch's Ghost. I think Witch's Ghost is my favorite movie
Okay.
of the whole Scooby franchise. Um, yeah, she was not, I wouldn't say she was necessarily scary. Like Scooby and Shaggy would have been scared of anything, but I didn't find that she was necessarily scary. Um, I thought that she fit really well, and I kind of felt like this was like as Thanksgiving-y as we're gonna get from Scooby because we don't have Thanksgiving episodes or movies. So I don't know. I liked her. I wasn't afraid of her. She wasn't. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I think that the fact
It's
that she only shows up like a few minutes in the third act, she
yeah.
doesn't have a much of a strong presence as the villain compared to, say, um,
Like
Lena
Ben
and Simone.
Ravencroft was scarier
Yeah.
than she was, I thought.
Oh yeah, and I think that that was probably the point, where, he's this unassuming guy and then he turns evil and he believes that he can be able to resurrect his ancestor from the trap book, thinking that that's essentially what he's going to do to gain power. And in reality, it just turned out no, he was actually being betrayed by his ancestor, saying that oh, I don't need you. I have more power and all that kind of stuff. So he just basically just gets pushed into the side and then she takes over. And again, she's not very threatening because, they were able to just like chase her around. They even try to like do a Wizard of Oz where they splash water on her and she just shows up wet. It's like that's not necessarily scary. But yeah, and she just comes and goes just as quickly. But yeah, you're right. I would argue that Ben is more or less the villain because
But doesn't that just feed into the whole premise of Scooby from the word go, though? The real monsters are the humans.
yeah, pretty much, exactly. The only difference is that he's not wearing, well, he's wearing a different type of mask. He's not wearing like, oh, the cheap mask that you get in a Halloween store or anything like that. No, he's showing off his persona. It's just that he's wearing the inner mask. He's been fooling everybody this entire time. So, yeah, in a way, that's actually a really good point, Mark.
The
Can
thing
I,
with her too was like at one point the book was laying on the ground and Velma had to bribe Scooby and Shaggy with a box of Scooby snacks to go and get it.
where did she keep that? I'm
Uh,
sorry, I need to know,
yeah,
where does
maybe
this
there's.
come
Shaggy's
from?
pockets.
I think that's going to be your next book, the spooky folklore of pulling out random things out of the air. Like is there like a dimension where you can be able to just pull out random stuff? I don't know. Like who knows?
But
Cartoon
at no
logic.
point did she go to get the book. And she had so much time because they were eating the Scooby snacks and then she destroyed the box. But it just sat there and
Yeah.
she never tried to grab it. So, any of the other villains would have been like, all right, it's there, it's mine, I'm taking it. But she didn't.
No. I guess maybe she's been trapped in that book for so long that she's just trying to comprehend the fact that, oh yeah, I could have just like grabbed the book if I needed to, but no, she's just like saying, I'm free, I'm free. It's been 10,000 years and it's now time to conquer Earth or something like that. I'm going all Rita Repulsa from Power Rangers, but yeah, anyway, but yeah, I think that when you compare Lena and Simone from Zombie Island, where they're very similar to what Ben was, where they're very unassuming, they're very sweet, they help out the gang. They bring them over to their house and talk about Morgan Moonscar. They kind of like lead them off, and then eventually they show off their evil selves when they turn into the cat creatures, wanting to like suck out their life form so they can stay youthful forever. I guess they, try to do something like that again with Ben, and with Ben was very successful. But again, the movie's called The Witch's Ghost. So again, you would assume that, Sarah is actually like the main villain of this. But again, it in a way it's kind of not.
Can I ask a question though,
Sure, yeah, go for
Nikki?
it.
Nikki, you said about the fact that the supernatural is real in a lot of this, right? And we have that in, as you say, in previous other versions of Scooby. Setting aside the scrappy episodes, which are obviously notoriously dreadful across the board, and we don't need to talk about that. Is it as effective for you? Because I spoke about this with Mitch,
Watson.
the showrunner of Mystery Incorporated, as to whether the show is as effective if the supernatural is real. Because the original premise of the development of the show is that it's not, for obvious reasons. And then they introduced the idea of the supernatural being a real thing. Is the show still as effective
It
when they do that?
depends. It all depends. Like, I thought Witches, Ghosts, and Zombie Islands were definitely more effective because the ghosts were real. But I wouldn't feel the same way if I was watching Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated and they were real. So it depends on how they're writing it, what they're doing.
But then in Return to Zombie Island, Velma can't handle the fact that it's real. So she starts to pluck out different reasons as to why it's not, right? It's a weather balloon, it's this, it's that. Yeah. So there's still that returning to that point that it can't be, because in some respects that has to be the premise of the show. I think it's an interesting point.
But that's only if you count Return to Zombie Island as being anything of value in the franchise. Because really, for them to dismiss all of that was not something that anyone that really liked Zombie Island agrees with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not saying it's the right thing to do necessarily, but for me, it's an interesting point because there's a whole kind of philosophical treatise behind this. So there's a theory that was developed in the 1970s by a philosopher, um, of the kind of the transition between what they called the uncanny and the marvelous. So the uncanny being the supernatural, being a thing that's explained, and the marvelous being the supernatural as an actual supernatural thing. And in the middle of this kind of transition between these 2 points, there's a central balance point, which is the fantastic. And that's the point that where you go between believing that something is supernatural and then realizing that it's not, or vice versa. There's this central tipping point where you're just not quite sure, which is this kind of feeling of safety, but at the same time being sort of safely scared by something. And that's the transition that most episodes of Scooby-Doo take. The supernatural is real in people's heads. Mystery Incorporated come in and investigate it. Halfway through, just before they realize that something a bit weird is going on, there's this kind of point where everyone's like, well, maybe it is. And then suddenly it tips over and you get to the point where actually, no, 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 it's a caretaker in a mask or whatever. This film kind of plays with that idea in an interesting way because it takes you on that journey at the beginning of the supernatural being real, and then you find out that it's not, and everybody relaxes, and then suddenly it subverts the whole thing again and goes, ah, no, well, actually it was. And I think that's quite a key point in this, is it kind of plays with what people's normal expectations are as well, which I think is effective in this particular case. And there's no effort on the part of any of Mystery Incorporated at the end of Witch's Ghost to try and explain that it wasn't supernatural. They solve the mystery insofar as they banish Ben Ravencroft. In fact, I mean, you could argue that this is one of the few versions of Scooby-Doo where a lead character actually technically dies, because unless anybody's going to find that book and bring him back again, he's done for. And that doesn't happen very often in this show. But there's no attempt to explain anything at the end as being actually rational. Everybody just goes, yeah, well, that happened then. Right, let's go and dance the Hex Girls now, and off they go.
But I do think that had they ended this movie with they unmasked the witch, it would have just not been as effective. It
No,
would
not at
not
all.
have been a good movie.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of like how I've seen in recent years where a lot of people are praising Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. I'm going into a Zelda discussion as somebody who doesn't know anything about Zelda, but my husband's been playing it. But yeah, from what I understand about the Zelda franchise, for some people, for the longest time, it was growing stale. It's like, okay, you have the same fetch quests over and over again. You get the companion, you go through the dungeons, and you fight off, the baddie, you save Zelda, you save Hyrule, go on and go on and go on, rinse and repeat over and over and over again. But then you have two games. You have Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom that came on the Switch, and it was able to change everything about a Zelda game. It was open world. You could do any task you want. You can gather up a whole bunch of things. I mean, you could save, Hyrule, or save Zelda, or or defeat Ganon any time that you want. You want to do it in the beginning, you can do it. You want to do it much later on, you can do it. And a lot of people really like that refreshing change of pace. It broke away from like decades of tradition, but a lot of people really do enjoy it. And there were even some people who argue that if they went back to the same formula, it would just be a disappointment because they just started revitalizing it and freshening it up. I'm sure if they would have went with the original ending, that it just turned out that the mayor and everybody in the town was behind the whole Sarah Ravenscroft thing to keep the traditions and all that kind of stuff. If we would have just left it there, I'm sure it would have been a disappointment, not only for people who like the franchise, but maybe even newcomers who probably got introduced to Zombie Island as their first film. It's like, yeah, but the last movie, the monsters were real. So, in this one, it's like, oh, it was a fake this entire time. That's a kind of a little bit of a letdown because they're expecting the monsters to be real at that point. So the fact that they were able to kind of like have a new perspective of what the franchise could be, I know that some people will say, well, they're just doing traditions. Well, I'm sure that when you have something that is, revolutionary to the franchise as it was at that time, it's kind of hard to kind of go back to tradition, especially when they were playing with tradition for the longest time. So I think that that's interesting that you brought up that you have like these two endings. You have, the traditional ending is like, okay, it was, this person behind a mask and, these people were behind it, mystery solved, bing, bang, boom, the end. And everybody can just go off and celebrate. But no, we have the actual ending where the monster is real. So, yeah, I guess, I guess they kind of wanted to like, drop people's guards because, in the last movie, the monsters were real. I mean, that was apparent. But in this one, it's like, okay, now it's a fake, and then the monsters were real. So, yeah, they would probably try to do this again in the next two Mook Animation films, right before they went back to basics with What's New and the other films that came out during that time period, where they just went resorting back to like, people behind in a mask. But
Yeah.
yeah, at that time, breaking traditions was something that was desperately needed because of how successful the Zombie Island was.
And I think what's unusual about the supernatural being real in Zombie Island and in this one, as well, is that in most cases, and Nikki will pull me up if I'm wrong on this, I know, in most cases in the franchise where the supernatural is real, most of the main characters are not in it. So when the supernatural is normally a supernatural event, Shaggy and Scooby, and sometimes Daphne are in it. Fred, Trapper, and Velma, voice of reason, are usually absent from those episodes. So 13 Ghosts, they're not in. Most of the scrappy episodes, they're not. And those are primarily where the supernatural is supernatural. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, even with the the Superstars 10, in which you again going into the whole Scrappy theme, where you have Reluctant Werewolf, you have Boo Brothers, and you have Ghoul School. Those were all supernatural. I mean, they got to meet up with Dracula, they got to meet up with the werewolf, the mummy, they got to meet up with their offspring, they got to meet up with ghosts. So, yeah, all of those were supernatural beings. And, in some handful of episodes of, the new Scooby and Scrappy-Doo show, there were some moments of supernatural. Most of them was just people in a mask. And then 13 Ghosts is, like you said, you have Velma and Fred are gone. Daphne, Shaggy, Scooby, Scrappy, and they're the ones who are dealing with, again, the supernatural stuff. So yeah, I guess you could say that these movies right here was kind of like the first time in which Velma and Fred are dealing with like the supernatural stuff. Yeah, so I guess since you brought it up earlier, I guess I'm sure there's going to be tons of people in the comments who are going to be disappointed that we didn't bring up the Hex Girls. So yeah, I mean, I guess it's interesting because the Hex Girls definitely kind of remind me of like, what if Josie and the Pussycats was goth and macabre? Let's see if we can just put that element in there, and beautifully performed by Jennifer Hale, Kimberly Brooks, and one of the members of the Go-Go's, if you can believe it. So they all do a fantastic job performing their songs, just as well known as when Sky Cycle performed Terror Time Again and The Ghost Is Here. So it's like one of the key essential songs that a lot of people remember when they think of songs that featured on Scooby-Doo. And yeah, they're great characters. They would follow up in various other incarnations, like with various of the movies and even the TV specials. So yeah, they've become staying powers. And it's I've been hearing a lot of people saying that they wanted to actually see the Hex Girls in the Scoob movie, but they only got like a small little cameo in the background, which a lot of people saying like that was cool, but it was actually disappointing that they weren't in it. But yeah, I mean, they pretty much just spun off into their own fan bases, and I can understand why.
Yeah, they deserve to have a spin-off in their own right, and it never happened, but it totally should have done. For me, I think that this version of the Hex Girls is probably the best in terms of design. Uh, I'm not overly impressed with the teeth, but outside of that, I think their whole look, their whole design, is probably at its best in this one. And also, they were ahead of the times, really, because so they described themselves as eco-goths, right?
Yes.
And at the time, the voice actors used to have a good laugh about this because at the time that was an invented term and they thought it was a little bit humorous and they had a good laugh about it. And now eco-goth is a recognized term as a subset of gothic studies. So the show was ahead of the game in this one, really.
Oh wow, that's actually interesting.
I do want to mention that the Witch's Ghost song in the movie was actually sung by Terry Wood, Angie Jerry, and Gigi Worth.
Oh, okay.
The other two songs were sung by Jennifer Hale, Kimberly Brooks, and Jane Wiedlin.
Oh, nice. Okay. And I guess also, to open it off, Billy Ray Cyrus sung the opening for Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? In the beginning, which is actually kind of interesting that around that time, Billy, I guess they were calling in Billy Ray to, perform as that. I just thought that that was actually really interesting.
That
He
was a
did
good
good
version
job.
too.
Yeah, it was. It was
Yeah.
actually a really good version. Yeah. It's kind of interesting to have like a southern drawl, of Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? Very interesting portrayal of the song. I've heard like there's a lot of multiple versions of it. I just thought that that was really interesting. Yeah, I think that with with what we got to see with what Witch's Ghost was able to showcase, and it's become a fan favorite for a lot of people. They regard it very well, put it up on high compared to all the other Scooby-Doo movies, and there's been a ton of them. There's no shortage of them, but a lot of people still regard it as like one of the best that ever featured, and I do agree with it because it definitely brings in the atmosphere. It has a nice slow burn, very similar to what Zombie Island was able to give us. It was able to introduce us with some great characters. Mystery was able to build up really nicely. You get that false expectation, and then you get the real ending, and it all played off really nicely. So yeah, I would say that they're both really good if you want to compare Zombie Island and Witches Go. They're just done a little bit differently. I can see there were some similarities that they were like, oh, this worked out really well in Zombie Island. Let's kind of like do it again, but tweak it a little bit differently. But yeah, I can see what they were doing to kind of like bring some new life and elements into what they learned from Zombie Island into Witches Ghost, and I think that they did a really great job with it. And again, it's something that a lot of people still praise and remember even still to this day. Yeah,
One,
I'd like to know your final thoughts on it.
a couple other things that I just wanted to mention.
Yeah, go for it.
So this is the first time that Scott Innes voiced Shaggy for
Yeah,
any.
because Billy West voiced him in Zombie Island, right?
Yeah, and he was doing Futurama at the time.
Oh,
So,
that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
and this was also the final film that was released during Mary Kay Bergman's lifetime that she voiced Daphne.
Yeah, and I did briefly talk about that when I did my From Pilot to Final Product on the Fairly Odd Parents, where Mary Kay Bergman was the original voice of Timmy Turner right before, she took her life away, and then Tara Strong took over. So, if you want to know more details about that, then go check out my video on it. But it's very tragic and very sad. But yeah,
Yeah.
Any other final words that you want to say, Nikki, Mark?
Yeah, just one other thing that I wanted to mention.
Yeah.
In an interview with Lance Falk that Mike Josick did on a podcast named Scooby-Doo, he mentioned that Rick Kopp and David Goodman, who wrote the script for this movie, they finished their script at the point where the witch was unmasked. And it was Glenn Leopold who wrote from that point on to finish the movie.
Oh, okay. So they I guess they just wrote like the first two acts, and then the third act, Glenn basically took it over.
Yeah. And Glenn's
Interesting.
an amazing
Oh
writer.
yeah,
Amazing
absolutely.
writer.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
hope to have him on the podcast someday. I have so many questions about both of this and SWAT Cats. And Johnny Quest as well. So I'd love to have him on if I could. But
Yeah.
yeah, he's amazing.
Yeah.
You have any?
Besides that, like I love The Witch's Ghost. Best
Mhm.
movie in my opinion. It was just such a fun movie. Ben Ravencroft is, I don't know, he's cool. I like Ben Ravencroft.
Yeah, he is cool. Yeah.
The Hex
Uh,
Girls, I really like them. So
Yeah. Okay.
I'd agree with Nikki. It is one of the best of the longer movies for sure, and it's got all of the elements that we recognise from the show that everybody likes. So it's got parody because you've got, I mean, Ben Ravencroft is essentially like if the unholy alliance of Stephen King and H.P. Lovecraft, right, in one body, and it's got Tim Curry to voice it. I mean, what more could you want? So it's got great characterization. It's a strong plot. From my perspective, it's really good in terms of its research. So the history and the folklore on the whole is spot on. Not only the big things, but the little things as well. There's one point where Fred thinks that the Hex Girls are behind this somehow, and is looking through the window and sees this kind of sort of strange potion making going on, which turns out to be the treatment that they use before they sing. And they talk about, using peppermint and cloves to ease their vocal cords. Well, cloves, peppermint, and ginger were commonly used as treatments for toothache and throat complaints in early healing processes. So the research is really good. The characters are really good. The design is spot on. There's very little really to not like about this one.
Yeah. If anybody is new to the franchise and you're looking for a nice movie to check out, this is definitely one of the high recommendations for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that concludes our discussion of Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost for Old Spook Lane Creepy Chat. So, Nikki, Mark, thank you so much for coming.
thank you for
Pleasure.
having us.
Yeah. So, plug and promote your stuff.
So you can find all of my links on ScoobyAddicts.com. I also run ScoobyMuseum.com, and I host the Scooby Panel podcast.
Awesome. And how about you, Mark?
You can find me at thefolklorepodcast.com. There's nearly 10 years worth of podcast material that you can catch on for free there. You can get any of my books from the web store on that site as well. And you can pick up a copy of Zoinks, the Spooky Folklore Behind Scooby-Doo, from anywhere that sells books in either paperback hardback or as an ebook.
All right. And as for me, you can check out my podcast feed, which is at Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Radio Public, all those places. You can check out my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/oldsschoollane. I'm on social media. Just type in Old School Lane. If you want to find me on Blue Sky, that's Patricia Miranda, or if you still follow me on X, which is at Patty_B_Miranda, Instagram, which is old_school_lane. New podcast will go up on the podcast feed first, and then it'll go up in a few days on YouTube. So thank you so much for tuning in, everyone. Let us know in the comments below about your thoughts of Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost. What did you think of it compared to all the other Scooby-Doo movies? Is it your favorite? Is it your least favorite? Or you think it's somewhere in the middle? Yeah, thank you so much for tuning in. Hope to see you around soon, and take care.